pros, and by pros, like the LeBron equivalent, so the people who are super busy, it's what they do. So if you bring that mentality to a job where you don't have as much on your plate, you get a lot of breathing room, you get a lot of flexibility. It really can open up a lot.
Hey, it's Ryan Holiday. Welcome to another episode of the Daily Stoic podcast. My guest today needs no introduction because he is one of our most popular guests of all time, one of my favorite authors of all time. I'm talking about Cal Newport, author of Deep Work, So Good They Can't Ignore You, and most recently, Digital Minimalism, and his new planner, the Time Block Planner, a daily method for deep work in a distracted world. I love Cal. I love talking to Cal. He's one of my favorite people, one of the people that I have missed not being able to see because I haven't been to DC now in many, many months because of the pandemic. But Cal is one of the best writers, I think, of our generation, one of the best thinkers about productivity and focus and creativity of this generation, and just overall a really smart, interesting guy, somebody I love talking to. So here's my episode with Cal Newport. You can check out his new time block calendar. We talk all about that. And of course, if you haven't read Deep Work, Digital Minimalism, or So Good They Can't Ignore You, you are definitely missing out. And Cal has a new podcast, which you should check out. And he and I did an interview about my most recent book, The Lives of the Stoics, which I suggest you check out. And of course, listen to my other episode, I think this is maybe from June, where I talked to Cal about being productive in the midst of this crazy pandemic that we're in. So check it out. Here's my conversation with Cal Newport. Well, I'm excited to do this. It was funny. I was going to say this in the intro, but so when your episode came out on the podcast last time, this was right as all the civil unrest stuff was happening in the summer, and someone commented, "How dare you interview a privileged white male on your podcast with all this going on in the world?" Even though our thing had been recorded, weeks earlier. And then it was the most popular episode of the whole year. So it was an interesting reminder to me that like the things that people sometimes manage to take offense to, which were totally unintentional, are not at all representative of what humans actually feel in the aggregate.
Yes, it's a terrible sample. Yeah. I made the mistake of asking my audience recently. I'd be like, send me suggestions for the podcast to this email address. I'm yet to have any two suggestions that are compatible with each other. Every single suggestion I've had is like its own. There's zero pattern in the suggestions. All of them are self-contradictory, and I realized there's no useful way. So sampling audiences doesn't work. Like unless you could actually like randomly sample your audience, it just doesn't.
Well, and then you also have to vet these suggestions against reality. So like the number one suggestion is always like, why do you have ads? And it's like, why do you expect me to spend hours of my life every single week, plus the cost of hiring an editor? And I think sometimes people think that everything is free and that it doesn't, like, because they're getting it over the internet. Therefore, and because there was no marginal cost for them to receive it, therefore there must have been zero costs to create it. So sometimes we get that with Daily Stoic. They'll go like, you have this store. Why do you sell stuff? They'll go like, what would Seneca think about this? Or, what would Marcus Aurelius think of this? And I sort of go like, well, if they took it, as they sat there on their estate tended by slaves, in their empire supported mostly by plunder and wars of aggression, I think they probably wouldn't have a problem with it, and I would actually
be okay with you selling the coin.
It's all right. But it's like, guys, this whole machine costs hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to run and operate and to reach at scale, and there's opportunity costs as well, which I think is obviously harder for people to understand. But like, every episode that you spend on your podcast is time that you didn't spend writing. It's time you didn't spend researching. But most importantly, it's time that you didn't spend at home with your family.
Yeah. Yeah. And my agent's always about that. When she fights back against like appearances and stuff like that, she's like, that's time that Cal could be writing his next book. That's always her thing. Yeah, I agree. Well, I think you and I have the problem that we've had audiences for a long time too. So like we have audiences that go back to the old days. So that's kind of the issue. It's like, in 2007 or whatever, I had my domain on a little server and there's 50 of us and those same people are around. So then it feels different. But yeah, like office space is expensive and equipment's expensive. I don't know.
No, that's an interesting point because it actually ties into, I think, a sort of a dilemma or an experience of becoming a successful creator or trying to master any profession, which is like, okay, when you start, not only like when you start, you're typically young. You're typically have this hunger to learn, and the level that you're doing it at is much more is much less expensive and easier and whatever. So it's like LeBron James playing basketball in middle school. This is just a guy that gets up, plays basketball, goes to practice, nothing going on in the world. As he progresses to where he is now, he now spends something like $1.5 million a year maintaining his body, right? He's the same person playing the same game, but to maintain it at the level that he's doing, because it becomes harder, and then because people figure out what you're doing, and it just becomes more competitive, the cost is greater. So it's weird that you'd think like, hey, as your audience grows, it would be easier to maintain, but it actually becomes harder because you're fighting against entropy and you're fighting against people who are in similar spaces, and just like you've already picked all the low-hanging fruit. So to keep writing good books, it's actually harder and harder to do.
Yeah. And the stakes raise, et cetera, et cetera. Just like LeBron had to bring home championships eventually. Yeah, that's different stakes.
Well, I wanted to talk about the journal because I'm fascinated, with journals. So let's talk a little bit about journaling, but let's start with the concept of time blocking, because it's not one I want to hear the case for time blocking.
Well, so time blocking is how I have for a very long time organized my day. So it was something I talked about on my blog. I went back to try to find the earliest references. I mean, I think it goes all the way back to 2013, but then I wrote about it in Deep Work, which was 2016. And it was my way of controlling my time and attention. I thought this was a pretty large missing component to a lot of time management systems, was this notion of, okay, when you actually get to your day, how do you figure out what I'm going to do? And a lot of the big systems, if we do like David Allen's, or you go back to some of the mentality even of Stephen Covey's, is based around like prioritization, tasks. You have lists, you have context, you have different priorities for tasks. And it's about going to your list and saying, what's next? And then, okay, now what's next? And what I had discovered is that if you look at the whole day like a chessboard, okay, I'm really busy here. I have free time here. I'm going to have a really busy into the day. You can start moving things around in a way that makes a lot more sense. Like, well, right now is going to be the time to work on this because I see what's happening at 3:00, or at 3:00, I'm going to have this window here. Maybe I should do a bunch of email there. But I probably should, when I go to run this errand, get these other things done. You see all the time, like chess pieces, it turns out you can get a lot more out of that same day than if you instead just try to go moment by moment. Okay, what's next? What's next? The other benefit I used to get from time blocking is it keeps you on task. Because if you're just working, if your idea is like, look, I'm going to work today, I'm going to try to get a reasonable amount of stuff done. I have some list, I have some meetings, okay, I'm going to take some breaks, obviously. Like, oh, this is what I'm doing for this half hour. I've already decided that. So no, I'm not going to take a break.
Sure.
Look at like baseball trade rumors, right? Like I'm locked into this right now. And if you want to take breaks, you schedule them in. So you also get more out of your time. So it had just been my secret sauce. And at some point I got frustrated with the notebooks I was using. And that's when I had the idea, like, well, why don't I produce my own?
No, that sort of goes to what we were talking about with LeBron James, where it's like sort of early on in your career, when you have more energy and less things pulling for your time, you can sort of get away with an amateur system. Like I wake up and I do whatever I was going to do today. You sort of go where it leads. But then as you become more successful, or as you have more balls that you're trying to juggle, it becomes increasingly essential that you have some sort of a system or a practice.
Yeah. Well, for me, I was using these type of systems before I needed to.
Interesting.
Because I was like a productivity nerd. And, I'd been really into this. I had written these books in college about how to be really productive in college. And so I was into productivity systems. So as a grad student, which is a really easy job. I mean, it seems like a hard job when you're a grad student because you haven't had any other job yet, but relatively speaking, it's an easy job. I was using all these systems just because I was a productivity nerd. And because of that, I had a ton of extra time. And so I was writing books and I was running my blog. I wrote a book concurrently with my doctoral dissertation because I was bored. Like I had a lot of time because I was using these techniques just because I was into techniques. As my job got harder, so as I went to become a postdoc and then a professor and then a tenured professor, but then also a dad and with a bunch of kids, and my writing career took off without the system. So I'm a little bit odd that I started it before I needed it. And because of that, I just had massive free time. And now that I actually need it, it absolutely is my lifeblood.
Yeah, it is funny that the people I know that were in grad school or are in grad school or doing PhD programs, it seems like it takes a very long time. And then I remember I was asking my friend, one of my best friends from high school, like how it was going. And he was like, you're not supposed to ask grad students how it's going because it's kind of this open-ended chaos. It's like a thing that just happens. And that strikes me as there must be incredible inefficiencies in that model that if you had systems, you could take advantage of and finish faster or get more done concurrently.
Yes. And I wrote about this a lot, especially back when I was aiming more at students with my advice writing. I called the phenomenon dissertation hell because there was a blog when I was coming up called Dissertation Hell, which encapsulated exactly that mindset.
Yeah.
Like grad students would construct this world of there's nothing more difficult than, needing to work on a dissertation. And you're absolutely correct. I mean, I say this on my podcast a lot because I get a lot of questions from students. And I say a lot on my podcast that being a doctoral student, in some ways, it's much easier than a normal job. And in other ways, it's much harder. So it's much easier in the sense like you don't have that much to do.
Right.
You don't have, but it's much harder in the sense that the things you do have to do are hard. They're intellectually demanding, and that short circuits a lot of people's brains. But I came into grad school with, first of all, my productivity habits. I was a nerd. I also got married very young, right? So I got married when I was 24, like right after I turned 24. My wife was 23, so she had a normal job all throughout grad school, and I just figured, look, I don't want to be at the office or, at MIT when she's home. So I'll just work during the time when she's working. I was like the only guy in the theory group at MIT who worked banker's hours,
Right.
But it turns out like it's really effective. You come in at 9, you make a plan for your day. I had way too much to do. I used to write 3 to 4 blog posts a week. I wrote 3 books while I was in grad school. I published a lot. I mean, I published a lot of papers. And I still felt like I had a lot of time. So I think there's a lesson in there.
The spouse life hack is an underrated one, or just being in a serious relationship, because I think it's a couple things. So one, looking back on it, it's like, oh, I didn't have a part-time job going around trying to meet people. Right? Like I never was going to bars. I never was spending time on dating apps. I wasn't trying, it was a no new friends policy. Like I was like, I already found my person. So that whole thing is out of the picture. So that was very helpful. But then it's not just the like, hey, banker's hours, because not every relationship has the specifics there that you're talking about. But I did find it was like let's say everyone's working at the office. And the people who don't have anywhere to be, they're sort of at the mercy of like Parkinson's law, right? It's like, hey, we're just going to go on this until whatever. But for me, it was like, no, I told my wife I would meet her for dinner at 8, or, like my weekends are spoken for. So I think it's not just the hours, but it's also having a backstop of another person who's sort of, whose time you have to respect, that prevents things from just expanding to fill an unlimited amount of space in your life.
Right. And this is a problem. So the problem you're pointing out here is another reason why, to bring it back, why time blocking is useful, because part of what you do when you time block, again, is you look at your day, your entire day, and say, what do I want to do here? As opposed to, again, if you're just working, this Parkinson's law thing, especially if you don't have a wife, you don't have to get home to pick your kids up from school. Yeah, you just fill the time. That's what grad students do. They stay up till midnight for some reason. They come. It makes no sense. But if you're time blocking, you're not going to draw out a schedule that says like, well, let me take 3 hours off here, And then let me kind of half work and watch YouTube from 4 to 7.
Right.
And I really think like 7 to 11, that's when I'm going to really, when you're actually looking at the schedule in black and white, you're like, well, wait a second. I could kind of get this all done by noon, and go do something else. Right. So like this underlying point is a big one, that if you don't control your time, and this was actually in my I'm thinking back now, my second book I wrote, which was a student book. I wrote it while predominantly still an undergraduate. It was called How to Be a Straight A Student. And it was study habits from actual straight A students, but I had a time management section that was my secret sauce, like what I had brought over from being an entrepreneur when I was a teenager. And basically, even back then in that book, I was saying time block. And I was a little bit looser about it then, but even back then I was saying, figure out in advance, like what you want to do with your time. This control notion, it opens up so much. And by the way, you were right. Like the pros, and by pros, like the LeBron equivalent. So the people who are super busy and super high, productive, it's what they do. I mean, they control their minutes. They control their days. They see, when should I do this? When shouldn't I do this? They're like air traffic controllers, except for instead of pushing 10, they're pushing tasks. And that really is how high performers operate. So if you bring that mentality to a job where you don't have as much on your plate as one of these super high achievers, you get a lot of breathing room, you get a lot of flexibility, you get a lot of space to pursue other things. You can induce implicit seasonality into your job, even though it doesn't exist. It really can open up a lot.
I haven't gone to grad school, but I find some similarities to what you're talking about with writing books. You and I will talk to someone and be like, "Oh, I signed a book deal," and you're like, "Congrats!" And then like 3 years later, the book isn't done. And, they're not Robert Caro and they're not Robert Greene. Like this isn't going to be some epic biography. And when I ultimately read the book, I go, there's not 3.5 years worth of work here. You know what I mean? Yeah. And I'm always surprised in how that happens. Because I know that the way you do a book is you show up every day. And in the space we're in, the sort of nonfiction, but not like sort of epic biography space, it's very unlikely that your argument is going to be so complex and require so much research that you shouldn't be able to turn this around in 6 months to a year. I mean, to get the manuscript done, editing and all the other stuff can take longer, but I'm always amazed. Like people are like, they ask me, how do you get so many books out? I'm actually amazed the other direction.
Well, let me run a theory by you. Excuse me. So right before we started recording, I was recording an episode of my podcast, and I was answering a question from a reader in Australia. And so she was in a PhD program, and she was preparing finally to write her dissertation. And so she was telling me how she was clearing the decks.
Yeah.
I'm leaving all my extracurriculars, I'm cutting down. And her question was, she was really nervous about I'm nervous about, how big these time blocks are going to get. Like, I really don't normally do more than 2 or 3, but I'm trying to clear the decks. I really want to get this done. And my answer was I think you're going to make things worse by inflating the difficulty here so much.
Yep.
You've inflated this thing in your brain into something that's going to require you to have nothing else going on, that, you have to quit all your extracurriculars, what she was doing, that it's going to take 6 or 7 hours a day or no progress will be made. I was like, I think that's going to make it take longer. And so I wonder if that theory is at play with some of these writers we know, where it takes them 3 years, is because if in your head, it's like, this is the hardest, biggest thing I'm ever going to do, then it's really hard on Tuesday to write when you're like, but I have 2 meetings and I have to take my kid to the dentist and I'm not really feeling inspired, treating it as not so big of a deal, maybe.
That's a good point. I mean, I find people who weren't writers, like they were somebody who did something and now they're writing a book. Maybe they had a podcast or a YouTube show, or they're an influencer or whatever. What can happen is they love books, and I love books too, but books are this sacred thing. But then because they haven't, like, one of the great advantages I got being a research assistant is I saw that books are just an assemblage of pages, right? It's not like some magical thing. It just is. And so I think they often get intimidated and they make up in their head what it's supposed to look like. And then so what they struggle with is the reality of writing a book, which for me, like I've worked on basically on 2.5 projects during the pandemic. It's like I get to the office at 8:30 and I'm like done, ready to eat, not think about the book at that level by like 11 at the latest some days.
Sure.
You know what I mean? It's like 2.5 hours is over 6 months is a book.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think academics know this because that's what academic writing is like. So like academics have an easier time and a harder time writing public facing books. They have an easier time because you produce academic papers on a regular basis and they have to be really smart. They have to go through peer review. So you're used to this idea of like, okay, I can produce something hard relatively quickly. So we kind of get used to that. And you write enough academic papers, it's all just, every day you look at the whiteboard, like it's just you make progress every day. The academics have a harder time sometimes though, because they are used to a level of rigor in their expertise that it just makes them really nervous when they're writing public facing books because they can't help but think about their peers in academia being like, I don't know. So
you can't be thinking about the audience. You got to be thinking about the task in front of you.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think there's something to be gained from that mindset of like, intellectually hard work. The way really nice products get built is just a little bit each day. I mean, you just think. Thought stuff, you have to just thought stuff. You have to generate. It's like thought reps, and you can only do so many a day, and you do them, and it's a job. Yeah. Well, I think even worse than though, not getting the book done is the other thing that makes me cringe is when you hear people talk about like, man, last 6 weeks, I barely slept because I had to get my book done, and
or they rented a cabin somewhere.
Yeah, that's not book writing. I mean, if you're doing it in 6 weeks, that's not book writing. I don't know what that is, but that's a failure too. That's not. No, it's you can't just grind it out when like under deadline pressure.
I wanted to talk to you today about Element. Element is a maker of electrolyte drink mixes that help you stay active at home, work, the gym, anywhere else. Electrolytes are a key part of a happy, healthy body. All athletes know about the importance of electrolytes, but the truth is we all need them, whether you're an athlete, a diabetic, keto dieter, whether you just want to curb carb cravings, or you want to keep a healthy family. Electrolytes are key for relieving hunger, cramps, headaches, tiredness, and dizziness. Element, that's LMNT, was co-founded by Rob Wolf. Rob Wolf's basically the founder of the paleo diet, a great New York Times bestselling author. He once cooked me some boar at a barbecue in Los Angeles. He developed this electrolyte mix himself. You can try it totally risk-free. If you don't like it, share it with a salty friend and they'll give you your money back. Plus, there's free shipping on all orders. Right now, you can receive a free Element sample pack for just $5. The sample pack includes 8 packets of Element, 2 citrus, 2 raspberry, 2 orange, 2 unflavored. And to claim this, you just go to drinkelement.com/dailystoic. That's drinklmnt.com/dailystoic. Go to drinkelement.com/dailystoic. No. There has to. It's a weird balance, right? Because it's the day-to-dayness of it, like the 2 crappy pages a day. I love that rule. It's just like you show up, you put in some work every day over a long enough time, and then you get an editable manuscript. Like if you don't do the work, you don't have pages which you can then edit and refine. But then, and this is something I struggle with more, like you have this impulse to ship, right? Like it's done, it's as good as it can be, let's go. But then you also need sort of it's like they like lay concrete and then they have to let it sit and then they need to see how it settles, So like I turned in my last manuscript. I think I turned it in on Wednesday of last week. And so I already have, like, these are my note cards today of stuff in the last 5 days that had just occurred to me that I wrote down that when I get the manuscript back in probably a month will all be changes that I'm making. So it's like, I'm not working on the book, but it's still kind of cooking in my mind and little marginal changes are sort of reveal themselves. But if it had already gone to the printers, like if I was, these people that are doing these sort of hot political books, you miss that ability to just get that sort of serendipity, like before it's too late kind of changes.
Yeah. Well, you're right. That's the downside of the way you get the book done is you have that mindset of, look, it's not, don't overinflate this, just right. But you're right. That puts you in the mindset of like, okay, let's roll. and going back and doing the edits, I struggle with that too. I mean, one of the ways I deal with, I always worry when I get to like the stage you're entering now with your latest book. I always worry. I start thinking like, what the hell is this? Like this last half of the book is, this is not right, or that's okay. That can't be the right way. I'm missing this. This is not like the greatest argument. And the way I get over that is I start thinking about the next book. I think it helps that you and I write a lot of books, because I just say, well, the next time it'll be better. And that's how I try to get past often it is a trade-off. I mean, I could probably sit more with my books, and really like come back and let me rewrite it, like try to masterpiece them. But instead I think I've got this idea, and I've been I'll work on it for a year. I think it's a good representation of it. Now let's move on to the next thing. So it's better, but it's a good point. I mean, I've noticed it, for example, being able to work in the last year or two with the New Yorker, they have a completely different editing process than you would have with a book.
Right.
And so like with the New Yorker, it's not a book. It'll be like 5,000 words. It's back and forth. It could be back and forth for months of like, this isn't quite doing it. I don't think this C section is not really like echoing the A section, like it's this sort of back and forth collaboration where it's just picked apart and rebuilt and tightened. And what about this, and bring this in? And it's a whole thing. And you can't do it with a book. Or if you do that with a book, it's like you can write one book every 5 years. So it's interesting. I feel that tension. And I get over it by being like, well, the next book will be better is what I always tell myself. And that's how I keep moving.
Well, this goes back to the time blocking thing, but I had a friend who is an NFL reporter, and NFL coaches work these insane hours. And I said, like, let's say the coaches union and the players union had come together, and there's some sort of, for whatever reason, and they said, just in the way that workouts for the athletes are limited, what if some regulation passed for the coaches where the coaches had to work bankers hours? Like it was 9 to 5 for coaches. You couldn't do all night film sessions. You couldn't go straight from the locker room after a game to the plane, to the practice facility. You couldn't work these insane hours. And I was like, would the product on the field be noticeably different in any way? And they were like, absolutely not. They were like, all the work that these coaches do, it has almost no, it's mostly a competition they are in with their staffs and with each other that, so I wonder, it's like, I've worked with some of those publications you're talking about. Is it really, is that the way they get to the quality they get to, or is this an anachronism and a system that's become almost a kind of a religious thing that actually, quantity would being able to produce more quantity would actually be a better way to get to more quality than the sort of whatever the process you're talking about is?
Yeah, I mean, if you have something that works, I get the hesitancy, why not shake it up? And I think you're right about that specific example. Look at Washington, D.C. Our football team, our head coach this year had to get cancer treatment during the season, and so it significantly reduced the time. The team might win their division. So
right now they're actually good for a change. They've had the least amount of coaching they've probably ever had, and it's working.
But I think your broader point there is probably, I think, is interesting. Yeah. In general, being worried about like what is proverbial religious, what like religious ritual in your life. Like, well, I do this way because this is how I've always done. I think this is what it needs to be done. And there's some notion to creative destruction. Like, well, what if we try it this way? Or what if we try that? Or, I mean, I do that with my habits all the time. I'm always looking for inefficiencies in the sense of like, why am I spending time on X? I don't need to do that. Is there a much simpler way to do it? I think I've saved a lot of overhead doing that. I mean, even with like my mini media company that sort of surrounds all the stuff that happens when you write enough books and do these type of things, all of my decisions have been biased towards reducing overhead, reducing complexity.
Yeah.
So I don't have staffs. I've tried to keep everything, and I think that makes a really big difference. I mean, I think it probably saves up like a non-trivial amount of time in my life. So just as a concrete example of, questioning this thing that's taking up a lot of time and produces some value, is it producing enough value?
Yes.
Is it producing enough value for the drag or for the overhead? Yeah.
Yeah, no, and that goes back to what we're talking about too with the price, right? And so sometimes people can think like, oh, that price seems high, or why is this not free or whatever? And it's like, because it has to pay for itself of the other things that the creator or the owner could be spending their time on. And if it doesn't, it becomes really hard to justify.
Right. Exactly. Right. It's not just not a hobby, but just, if you're just starting a podcast on the side, for example, outside of your, it gets, it has some traction. It's a completely different calculus than, right. Like Ryan Holiday spending, if he's going to publish something every day, for the Daily Stoic podcast, that's a book a year, maybe, right? I mean, almost.
Daily Stoic is, it's about 80 to 100,000 words a year that I do in the email.
Yeah.
And so, that's a book a year.
Yeah. And which is a non-trivial amount of money these days. So, there you go.
No, it's
if you're a world famous author like Ryan, I mean, a book a year is it's not.
Well, so I was going to ask you to go back to this idea of planning. So here's why I don't time block, and tell me what I'm missing. Because I think earlier on in my life, I also had a lot of arrogance about my systems. So it's like, this is the way that I do it. This is obviously the only way to do it. And anyone else who's doing it differently is somehow an indictment of the way that I'm doing it. But as I've gotten older, I think I've gotten more flexible about trying different things, which is, I think, the way you want to go. I think a lot of people go the other direction, that as you get older, you become more closed-minded to new things. But when I look at like a person who has a time blocking schedule, I actually get like anxiety. I've talked about this before. Like, I like an empty calendar. Like today, this is the only thing in my entire calendar. That to me is like a good day. Whereas like later in the week, I've got like 3 things in the calendar and some other thing that I like, some sort of administrative obligation. And I'm like, shit, that's a crappy day. You know what I mean? So for me, like when the calendar is full, that actually means I have less time to do what I want, which is usually writing and thinking and reading.
Yeah. But you can think of time blocking as how you make use of the empty days. Right.
Okay.
Like those are actually the days when time blocking is useful, right? I mean, if you run a day that's full of meetings, full of Zoom, full of calls or this or that, that's actually the scenario in which time blocking is not that useful. I mean, you have your calendar, and if that's all you're doing is jumping from call to call, you don't really need auxiliary planning. But if you have an empty day, to me, this is when time blocking shines, because you're like, okay, well, what do I want to do with this day? And you kind of wait till you get there to make the decision, right? So it's not,
right.
It's not looming. Like, okay, what I really want to do is I want to write first thing in the morning and get this thing done here, this errand, and I'm going to work on this in my head when I do that errand. And then this frees up time here to do this thing with my son. And then I want to come back here and do this, and I can be done. And I can be done at 3.
Right.
Look, I got the plan here, and then I can do a shutdown. I can do a shutdown when it's done. So it allows you to take the open water and put some structure onto it, and you get a lot more out of it. Though I will say, the thing about you though is one scenario in which time blocking is not as useful is if you have a combination of autonomy and routine. So like
right.
full-time writers can fall into you have a routine. Like, so full-time writers can fall into this interesting middle zone where a lot of days it's like, I have a very common structure to my day and I have a ton of autonomy. So I'm not juggling a lot of a lot of time blockers are trying to figure out, how do I make sure this gets done and these tasks are accomplished and I'm making progress on this thing that's due next Wednesday. It's
right.
really optimized for that. If you're in a writing routine, I write and then I do this and then I'm done or something like that. People who have a lot of routine and a lot of autonomy don't always get as much benefit. So you might also fall into that gray zone. But I think the empty days are the days where time blocking actually relieves my stress a little bit. Because I'm like, okay, I have a plan. and I executed it. And now I love the distinction of I'm done. And a good time block plan gives me that, and like, oh, I'm done. Or I can end the day early in my time block plan and actually get that psychological boost of, oh, I got an early into the day, because somehow I followed the schedule. So I feel like my boss granted me an early release, as opposed to, oh, I stopped working early. So
yeah, I guess hearing you say that, maybe I'm more of an implicit time blocker than an explicit one. Like my assistant knows never to schedule, essentially never. Don't schedule things before 11 a.m. and don't ever schedule anything that goes later than 4 p.m. And so, like, really the only time that things can possibly be scheduled is really in that sort of 4 or 5 hour window there in the middle, that often doesn't get filled anyway. So the morning is already blocked off for writing, and then the afternoon is blocked off for family. Then the middle part is essentially blocked off for whatever random stuff I have to do for the day, whether it's recording a podcast or shooting a video or doing a phone call. That's where those things get slotted in. And ideally, they don't even get slotted in because I'm not doing them.
Yeah, no, and that's not a bad way to do it. So where time blocking is going to really start to shine more is when you're juggling a lot. And you have to figure out, okay, I have meetings that I don't control at various times. I have tasks that are due at various times. I have larger projects that are due at various times. Progress needs to be made regularly. This needs to get started early. I need to fill in this gap here. So a lot of people who are in, let's say, like a standard knowledge work job are in a consistent state of having this pool of things that are on their plate that is too big to get your arms around on any one day. It's just big and stressful. And so every day is like, how do we construct a day that is not only going to make the best attack into that, but also make sure that we are on track for all the different things that we need to be on track for. And in those scenarios, time blocking does really well. It also does really well, as I mentioned before, when people have actually a lot of flexibility.
Right.
I'm at home. I'm working from home. I don't have a ton of meetings. Maybe it's been very useful for people during the pandemic because maybe them and their partner are both at home and there's some childcare that has to happen, and suddenly having a lot of clarity about, I'm going to work here on this, and you here, I'm taking care of the kid and you're doing this, and this ability to really just move your days together and move those pieces like chess pieces really helps people, when it otherwise just seems like chaos. I'm at home, I'm kind of watching the kid, and I'm kind of not, and this is happening, and my mind is wandering. I'm in the same room that I also watch TV in, and I'm there's a nice clarity to it. Like, this is what I'm doing right now.
There is something to the close of the day you're talking about. Like for me, like a good day is, so this is maybe like this. So a couple of years ago on one of my books, I did these signed pages, and they ship you the pages and you sign them. And there was like 2,000 extra ones or whatever. That's what I use as my to-do list. It's like the perfect consistency of paper. It's like the right length. Anyways, that's what I do my to-do list on every day. But what I've really loved, like a good day is I've crossed all the things off on the to-do list, and then I'm tearing up the list at the end of the day. I have like a compost bin next to my desk, and I tear it up, and then I recycle it later. But a day where I got distracted or got busy or things went wrong, when I'm carrying the to-do list over to the next day, there's something. It feels like I'm carrying a balance on my credit card. Do you know what I mean? It feels like I'm not closing the day.
Yeah. Well, but see, one of the advantages of blocking over just listing is now you can look at your whole day and say, well, what's the best way to get these 5 things done? And well, the best way is that like these 3 I can consolidate. They're kind of short, and I'm going to do it in this 1 hour block between these 2 meetings, which means this one I probably should do right now in the morning because I have 90 minutes and it's going to take that long. And this other one, I'm going to have to move that call because this is really urgent. And then that's where that's going to fit in. And suddenly you get all 5 done. Whereas otherwise you might have wasted the first 60 of those 90 minutes sort of doing email and then miss that window in between because, and you end up getting less done. And then the other part of time blocking is when you break your schedule so it doesn't work out because something goes long or something drops on your plate, which is fine and normal, you rebuild it. So in the planner, there's these columns. So as you break a schedule, you cross out the rest, you move over to the next column, and then you fix the schedule in that column. And then if you break it again, you cross out and you move over to the next column, right? So you rebuild your schedule when it changes. So you're always trying to maintain intentionality about like, okay, what's the best I can do with the time that's left? But that exercise really teaches you how long things take. And you start to realize like, okay, I can't just fool myself into how long it's going to take to whatever, write this type of memo, because I'm gonna have to rebuild my schedule. So then you start to develop a much more nuanced understanding of this takes much longer than I think. And then once people get that more nuanced understanding, they start making more changes to their schedule. Then they look at their calendar and say, this is untenable. These meetings are spread in such a way that it's impossible for me to get what's done. All right, let's do like Ryan does, nothing before 11. Or I need to get out of this, this, and this, right? Like you suddenly, it's like you're getting real good data on you as an execution machine, how long things take, what your schedule actually looks like. You're like the football coach looking at the plays. And then it leads to people making changes because you're getting the data you need. So you're not just, I don't know, I'm busy. I'm always trying to do things. I feel like I'm carrying my list over from day to day. Now you can pinpoint, you can diagnose the problem. This is what's going on. And you can, so there's all these ancillary benefits that float around that approach.
One of the things that hit me when you were talking there is like, these people go, with like my note cards, like how I research books, they go, wouldn't there a digital system be a more effective, efficient way to do that? And sort of what you were describing, it's like, hey, something bumped, now you got to redo the thing. Well, the impulse in today's society is like, oh, digital is where that should happen because it, you adjust one thing and then it can adjust all the other things. But it strikes me there's actually probably something to the physical form being forced to do it by hand that you like about it, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, it means you don't have to go on your computer
right.
to see what's going on and to adjust it. So if you're in a mode where you're reading or writing and you don't want to go on to a tool, you don't have to. Yeah, it's embodied. So you're drawing out these blocks, you're crossing out the blocks. And so I agree with that. And I don't know, digital tools, I mean, they have their place, obviously. I think there's certain things that digital tools are good for. I think digital tools are good for calendars because, look, if you have a really busy schedule, there's a lot of appointments coming and going and moving, and I think digital takes that out. I think digital tools are good for keeping your master task list because a lot of
collaborating.
People... Yeah, or collaborating like we're doing, or if you want to keep track of 500 tasks, like I don't want to write all those and move them around or this or that. But I think for scheduling, there's something to it. I mean, there was this movement, in the early 2000s, like 2000 to 2008, there was this productivity movement that thought computer algorithms combined with productivity was going to like unlock stress-free work and peace, and it was going to make everything much easier, that we could kind of, what was causing us stress was trying to figure out like what to work on and what was going on in our schedule, and computers should be able to do that.
Right.
And then we could make work much less stressful. We could basically outsource all the executive decision making to machines. And that's when you got tools like OmniFocus, in which you could have tasks that existed with these different statuses and contexts, and then run these complex queries that would essentially spit out, work on this, and none of that worked. Right. It turned out like you can't, that wasn't the key. If we could just outsource into these digital tools, like really complicated tools would tell us like what to do, and we could just crank widgets and the whole thing would be just sort of automatic and life would be low stress. It didn't work out. It turns out that like a big part of the art of work is figuring out what to work on and when to work on it, and doing stuff is hard. And actually most of the difficulty was actually doing stuff, not in the deciding what to do.
Right.
And that actually just having a piece of paper and just confronting your day and saying, what do I want to do today was actually ends up being the right thing to do. That having a computer database spit out, make this call next, and you would just do it. That didn't work. There's few things better than just, I'm confronting the whole picture and this is roughly my plan and I have to just do it now.
What's the difference between a planner and a journal, in your opinion?
Well, I think of a journal as capturing expository information about your thoughts of your day, whereas a planner is where that's retroactive. A planner is prospectively looking forward to what do I want to make out of the day.
Sure.
So my journal, I'm capturing thoughts, like here's what I'm thinking about, here's what happened today, here's what's on my mind. In a planner, I'm saying, I mean, it's much more pragmatic. It's just, I have 7 hours today. What am I doing with those 7 hours? And this is the tool I'm working with. It's my cartographer's map and ink, right? This is the tool I'm working with to figure out what do I want to do for the next 7 hours.
Although yet what's interesting about doing it contemporaneously is that it then becomes, in retrospect, a journal of how you spend your life, of how you spent your day, which is in the aggregate how you spent your life.
Yeah. Well, which is one of the big things I sell about the planner is you have a record now. So it's really easy to go back and flip through your time block grids for a bunch of days. And you have right there evidence of what's going on. I mean, I recommend that people have patterns for their blocks to differentiate them. So like I shade in thicker lines, deep work blocks. So those blocks have thicker lines. You can just look at a day and just see
Right.
like where were their deep work blocks. And then I added a metric section to every day for the planner. Big believer in metrics. So, deep work hours, number of steps I took, number of calls I made, whatever it is that you want to track. Yeah. So that gets tracked every single day as well. So now you can go back through a planner is whatever it is, 3 months or 4 months. You can go back through and see what's the story. What's the story of these metrics? Like you have a book that captures 1 quarter, 1 season of your life. And I agree with that. I think the learning is a huge thing. Learning about how long things really take, how much am I really getting done? A lot of people who are new to time blocking will be like shocked to see the degree to which, wow, I do very little outside of meetings and email.
Right.
And
yes.
I'm trying to build these days, and that's all I have time for. And every time I try to put something in, it gets blown up for email. And it's I think like something like that is a really important reality check. And either they have to just say that's my job or make drastic changes to their jobs, but we're like without the feedback. So I think you're right on that. It's like a non-linguistic journal in some sense, as well as a prospective planning tool.
Yeah, I do this one journal in the morning and a bunch of people make them now, but it's just, you write 1 line a day. So I write what I did yet, like 1 sentence about the day that just passed. And what I'm now almost 4 years into a 5-year journal. And what I love is being able to write, today, what I did yesterday, but then see what I did 366 days ago, and then double that and triple that. And so to be able to see sort of how life is progressing and what was memorable about this day on the planet 1 year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, in some ways is almost more representative as a journal than me trying to write, what I'm thinking and feeling. Do you know what I mean? There's the literalness of it is almost more revealing than the prose on the other journals.
I did that the almost first 2 years of my first son's life. I had one of those exact journals. They're like, we did this, we had these people over, here's what's going on with sleep. And I got that exact same benefit out of it. I would go back and say, where were we like a month ago? Where were we 6 months ago? Where were we this point last year?
Right.
And it gave me a really good sense of progress. I was like, oh, okay, interesting. Like, look, it's different. Back then we were like overwhelmed and we weren't sleeping and someone came by and now look where we are today. And I remember that being really meaningful. So I'm with you on that. I think that ability to look back and say, what was I doing? So I'm hoping now that I have these planners that I can have a nice shelf full that builds, because that'd be really nice. Like, well, what was going on, pandemic fall 2020, I can actually see, it'll be good for our biographers.
I'm not sure either of us have done anything notable enough to warrant our papers even being reviewed at a university, but that remains to be seen. My last question for you was, I've gone through waves of this during the pandemic. Like I think you and I, we talked in June ish, and or maybe it was May, but Texas has gone through this weird cycle where, we took the pandemic very seriously, and then we all collectively pretended it was over. And then not we, but then the state collectively, pretended it was over. Then it got serious again. Then leading up to the fall, we pretended again. And then obviously now here we are in winter and it's a disaster. But what's been weird for me is like my sort of quarantine bubble and productivity bubble has been nice because I haven't been doing anything. I've been doing meetings. I've been focused, creative, not going anywhere. But I've noticed that when everyone else is going back towards real life, all of a sudden the pull, it becomes harder to say no, I guess with what I'm saying. Have you done much thought? Let's say the vaccine is here. Let's say, certainly, but in the next 6 to 8 months, some semblance of a more integrated, extroverted world may be upon us. How are you thinking about people maintaining this kind of deep work bubble that some of us have been in?
Yeah. I mean, I have been thinking about that even for myself. So, I mean, part of the question is what to not let back,
Yes, exactly.
or is it even going to be possible? That's what I'm trying to figure out, is what not to let back. I mean, I have this sense that I'm probably going to be in certain situations untruthfully exaggerating my virus fears, probably
Yeah.
like well after the point where I actually am worried. Like, I really wish I could come speak, but I don't know about the vaccines, only like 5% effect, to get out of some trips.
Yeah.
I don't know how long we'll get away with that. I mean, I think the first things I have on the books right now.
I've been using my elderly in-laws as a fantastic excuse. Hey, look, I would love to come to your outdoor, mask wearing garden party, but I just can't. I'm going to be seeing my elderly in-laws next week, and I can't even take the most remote risk. And people are like, oh, sure, please don't come. And yeah, I don't know how long that I can sustain that.
Yeah. How long are we going to get away with that? Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say the first things I have in my books that are, in theory, traveling in crowds is like next fall, I think. And I don't even know how I feel about that. Not from a viral perspective, because it'll be adjusted if need be, but from flying again,
Right.
and having to go, like, you went through a book launch during the pandemic. I have one coming up in March, and it's sort of nice.
Oh, it's way better.
It's great. It's like I invested in the studio, and I can do TV, I can do radio, I can do podcast. So, but I am missing, I guess, is like, so one of the ideas I have, for example, is so I miss more one-on-one interaction, like with other sort of interesting, smart people. So like I've already sort of started laying the groundwork for a writers group here in DC. There's a bunch of really interesting writers here who I know and I like, and they write for big publications. And I'm like, okay, that type of thing I am looking forward to getting back to. We built out this big socially distanced patio, which is, there's certain things I do. Like there's a group of guys we watch movies with and stuff like that, that like enabled those type of things to keep going, because we have this big thing and these nice armchairs that are, spaced out or this or that. So I don't know. It's going to be interesting. What do you think about, what are you going to do with speaking?
Well, it's weird. Like to go to your point about the book launch. So I did Lives of the Stoics in September, and so I didn't travel anywhere. I actually didn't even do kind of a full launch. In some respects, I wasn't treating it as like a full book launch. And it sold. I mean, it debuted at number one. It had a launch on par with, several of my other books. And
do you think it made no difference? You think it made no difference? Like if we could do a counterfactual, or is it just like your fame is rising? So like
it's hard to tell. I mean, let's say
what else you won? I guess you're number one, right? Like it was and as people don't really realize about these type of books, like big launches are nice, but like a big selling book versus not, usually, at least for you and I, is going to be a story written over 3 years, like it's not like the number of books sold in like a successful launch is still, 10% at most of a successful book, whether it had, so anyways.
No, ideally the first week should become a forgettable note in a long selling career of a book. So yeah, I definitely think about that. I mean, maybe if I'd done more events or something, that the first week sales could have been 10% higher, which might have been, not that many more books, right? And so I think it was a different experience. It was a better experience. The speaking thing is interesting because like this month, I think I'm close to, if not surpassing, my best speaking month since I started speaking ever.
Yeah.
And I haven't left my house. I've done, and so that if you're telling me I could I could maintain that, or
What if
even
that goes
half that.
away?
Yeah.
That's because I've been doing. It seems like you probably had the same experience. Everyone didn't move virtual for a while. At least they wanted to see what was going on, and then starting in like September, everyone's like, okay, we'll do it virtual, and
Yeah.
it's just fantastic. I mean, it's you're doing 45-minute Zooms for
Yes.
lots of money, but are they going to? Let's
I
say they
know.
don't keep doing that. That's the
I know.
thing. Yeah.
I know. I think what I found that the big breakthrough for me was, okay, yeah, there was that period. So basically from, let's say, March to May, there was no virtual speaking because people hadn't gotten there yet, because everything was just getting pushed. What I found, if you had told me at the beginning of the year, hey, 2 months, that cost me quite, like, let's say 20% of my year's income, those 2 months or the 3 months of stuff that got canceled. If you told me I was going to absorb that hit at the beginning of the year, I'd been like, well, that's going to be untenable. But what I actually found was that energy just got redirected towards other things that were also that were not just revenue positive, but were creatively fulfilling and personally less disruptive, right? Because I wasn't traveling and all that. And so I think we opened this talking about opportunity costs. I think the opportunity costs of speaking and traveling and doing these other things is now harder for me to deny. So I hope I'm going to be able to say no to more things, but I don't necessarily trust myself either.
Well, I mean, so not to get too insider baseball, but so what do you think about this theory that, when it comes to like a book launch for someone like you, or someone like me, like the actual model is you have an audience, right? So you have an audience that is a consumer of your essentially media channel. And that audience is going to sell a lot of book at first, but they're going to be the seed that's going to spread the word, because you have X thousands of people, and if they really like the book, they'll be spreading the word, and that kind of dwarfs any most particular just you talking straight to people that aren't part of your audience. So then from that viewpoint, and we have common publicists who are probably watching this right now, or so they might get them heart attacks. Just hey, portfolio, I'm just hypothesizing here. Okay, I'm just hypothesizing. But from that point, there's maybe a new model where it's like, yeah, you're focusing on, you have like a media company, and you're focusing on that and what you produce and your shows and your writing, this big audience. And one of the things your company produces is books, and your audience will take it and embrace it and help spring it out there. And like you're saying, the notion of you have to start from scratch, like I have to go out there and tell an audience about a book, maybe that's becoming depreciated in this world of like you own your own media companies, basically.
Well, I think you'll find that on the launch of your next book, which is like for the virtual stuff. They'll go, okay, hey, obviously, insert indie bookstore cannot do an in-person event, but they want you to do an Instagram live event or something. And you go, okay, how many people currently attend, their Instagram live things? And they're like, oh, between like 50 and 60. And then you're like, and how many books are they selling? Oh, like 5 to 10. And you're like, whoa, okay, that's an hour and a half of my life. Plus it's got to occupy a block on the calendar to sell 7 books. I mean, when you look at the royalty, that's like $15 or something. But more importantly, you go, oh, if I just record an extra episode of my podcast, that will reach however many tens of thousands of people. Or if I just write one article, that will reach this many people. Or if I, so you sort of realize, I think what the pandemic made clear, and I think makes extra clear for creators, is like actually investing in your platform day to day is the best use of your time. And these launch activities, or these speaking, or the things you're going around doing, actually aren't moving the needle for you at all. And they come at the expense of building this other thing, which you then own and have, the best chance of, sort of getting someone to check out your book or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's something to that. And of course, the caveat being it's very hard to do. And like most people aren't going to be, I mean, the create a media channel that has a lot of listeners, but yeah, I'm starting to feel that way. I mean, I've started this podcast. I'm doing some other things because I was.
Would you have started this if there wasn't a pandemic?
Probably not. This was a pandemic project. Yeah. Because I wasn't, I'm always around people. I'm in front of my students. I'm in front of audiences. I'm in front of I'm always interacting with people, and I felt very isolated. And so I said, okay, how can I I did a lot of writing at first. The first month I wrote a blog post every day just because
Yeah.
I was antsy. I wanted to do something. And then I was like, I don't know if this is the right way to reach out to this audience. And then, so I started the podcast as a project. I was inspired by some of the Spotify acquisitions. I was getting, suddenly I started seeing, I was like, oh, podcasts are not necessarily just this thing that people do in their spare time because they kind of feel like they have to. I was like, oh, this is actually a media model that's very, very powerful and very disruptive and very distributed and very decentralized, right? It's not through major players. Your stuff is not owned. It's you and a server company that host it. And
right.
So the pandemic got me doing it, but it's definitely changed the way, because I'm talking to a web designer, and this is a small point, but thinking about even like calnewport.com. Like I'm having this realization for the redesign I'm thinking about is it shouldn't be an author website. Like author websites are all about like, let me tell you about this author. And I'm like, no, probably the better analogy is more like a streaming service website. It's like, this is a place you come.
Here's all the
very
different
clear
stuff.
Point of view. Yeah, there's a content, and you come here because you are on board with that point of view and the ideas and the way they're delivered, and you want to consume it. And there's different media in which it's coming. But you think of it the same way as when you go to Netflix or something like this. It shouldn't be about what's my bio. It should be about there's new episodes of this, that are available.
No, I love it. Well, look, let's do this again when the new book comes out, which I won't even tease for people. Let's talk in March, and I'll be very curious to see how you handle a pandemic book launch. Yeah,
well, I'll take lessons from you. I'm assuming if it goes half as well as yours, I think I'll be pleased though.
All right, man. I appreciate it. This was awesome as always.